Well, unfortunately, you're talking about a $3.6 trillion budget with about $1.5 trillion worth of deficit, with a deficit of $1.5 trillion. You're talking deficits in the range of 10% of our economy, or 10% of gross domestic product, I think, which we all acknowledge is simply unsustainable. Unsustainable. And to put it in perspective, since the Second World War, I believe in 1983 was the greatest budget deficit we ran as a percentage of the economy, which is how we measure it, and that was at about 6%. And that was during, of course, a very deep recession. During the early 80s, I graduated Penn State in 1982, and I remember unemployment rates in this community about that were approaching around 12% at that time. And it was a very bad economy, and so deficits obviously were quite high back in the early 80s. So now we're talking 10%. Even during the Depression, we never had deficits on this magnitude in terms of percentage of the economy. Didn't happen. During the Second World War, we did. Our deficits were about 20% of the economy. Now I think we can all argue that, and rightfully so, that we were engaged in a great enterprise, that survival was at stake here for many people throughout the world, including ourselves. We've been attacked by Imperial Japan, Pearl Harbor. So I think people understood why we were engaged in that kind of deficit spending at that time. So the issue becomes, what do we do about it? I'd be happy to get into some discussion about that, but that's, I think, the pretext of what's happening in Washington. We had a stimulus bill that came up about a year ago, a little over a year ago, that frankly, in my view, borrowed too much, spent too much, and delivered too few jobs. It was over $1 trillion when you count all the financing. It was all borrowed. It was all borrowed. Borrowed money. And knowing that fact, and the Congress, knowing that the deficits are at an unsustainable level, enacted a healthcare bill, healthcare law, that when fully implemented will cost $2.5 trillion over 10 years. I can assure you this is not going to be, this will add to the deficits, not lower them, despite what some have said. It will add to the deficits. I believe very, very substantially. So here we are. I'll speak more to that issue of spending a little bit, but at least in the short term, I want to make a comment or two about, you mentioned also the immigration situation. Well, this issue is certainly heated up again since Arizona enacted a statute. By the way, I have a copy of the law here if anyone wants to see it. It's not that long. I've read through it, as well as the subsequent amendment to the law. But Arizona did pass a law basically requiring local law enforcement to enforce immigration law. I mean, that's maybe an oversimplification, but that's how I interpret their statute. In fact, it was 2 weeks ago, this past Thursday, I sat down with the Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano, former governor of Arizona, and it was just a few of us in the room. It was a closed-door meeting. I just asked her very bluntly. I said, Madam Secretary, could you explain to me the difference between the Arizona law and what is currently what we call the federal 287G program? That's a program where the Department of Homeland Security, through ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we will train local law enforcement, state and local law enforcement, to enforce federal immigration law. It's not mandatory, but we can allow, we make those services available to law enforcement to help us enforce the law. We think that it's a good thing. And her answer to me was interesting. She said, well, the only real difference is that it's a question of priority. That under the 287G program, we emphasize human smuggling, obviously terrorism, and criminal activity, drug dealing, etc. And one of my colleagues who was sitting with me at that meeting, Lamar Smith in Texas, who's the head Republican on the Judiciary Committee, he said, that's a good question. He said, the truth is that the 287G program doesn't establish priorities. The administration establishes priorities. That's not in the law. The law is pretty clear. And he said, the truth is, because that's what the Secretary said, Madam Secretary, there really isn't much of a difference. So a lot of this yelling and screaming about the Arizona law, actually, at least as it was amended, looks very similar to the 287G program that many municipalities contacted my office about how do we help enforce. And the reason we have that program is because there are some municipalities that are called so-called sanctuary cities. In fact, Newark, New Jersey,